Hello, everyone, and welcome back to 305 Insights. I'm your host, Alan Somerton, and today we're going to be focusing on the halfway point of college football and where things stands for teams, just a general overview of what's going on in college football world. And it's been an interesting season in the sense of the 12-team playoff has allowed for a lot of teams to believe that they are championship contenders, when in reality it might be playing out a different way. But we also might have some surprises and some teams that are able to withstand a few bumps in the road. So, that being said, I kind of wanted to start off with disappointing teams and most impressive teams. But I believe there's something that needs to be addressed in terms of the overall health of the sport. There was a lot of issues coming into the season about the restructuring of conferences, realignment, the amount of money that the SEC and the Big Ten are making compared to the ACC and the Big 12 and the remnants of the Pac-12 now and the Group of Five conferences. But I don't think it can be argued that NIL and the transfer portal have allowed a more balanced overall talent pool in the game today. Now, previously, fans, pundits, just overall casual viewers of the sport would lament the fact that every year it seemed like it was, a variation of Alabama, Georgia, Clemson, Ohio State in the college football playoff. And for a lot of years, it kind of was that. There was always those mainstays that were consistently in the 14 playoff. And now you're seeing the ability of teams to lure talent away from some of these successful programs with the promises of a starting gig to show off your talent. And I think that is reflective in the standings or just based off the eye test. I mean, we take Georgia, for example. Georgia doesn't really look that mean and powerful, however you want to describe it, in the front lines. I mean, Kentucky push them around. There's some talent on Kentucky, absolutely, but over the years, Georgia was pretty much able to manhandle everybody. And you're seeing with the transfer portal how they've lost some players and, maybe they weren't able to get certain players in, that their floor might be a lot lower than people expected. And that's not saying much. I mean, Georgia might finish with 2 losses this year. They had the loss to Alabama and they have the game against Texas coming up. And then how many other games may they lose? Not as much as you'd think. But again, the ability to withstand injuries is the key. And there isn't that depth that they used to have thanks to the transfer portal. And you have to combine, when I brought up the two, you have to combine the transfer portal and the NIL, because take a perfect example, keep on talking about Georgia. You had Dylan Raiola was committed there, and then he flipped to Nebraska, amongst other things. I believe he has an uncle and or a family member of some kind on the staff, as well as guaranteeing there's a significant NIL contract that he signed. That wouldn't have happened in the past. He would have went straight to Georgia, would have said sorry to his family member, and just waited a few years at Georgia before starting after, whoever's next in line. Or he might have been the person next in line. And you're seeing bits and pieces of that in different areas of this sport. I mean, look at the exodus of some sense that happened in Alabama. You know, yeah, they lost some players to FSU, but more importantly, they lost Isaiah Bond to Texas, the talented wide receiver, and they lost Caleb Downs, the all-world safety, to Ohio State. Would that have been possible without the lure of NIL contributions and or the ability to transfer without sitting out a whole year to play for the likes of Steve Sarkisian at Texas and Ryan Day and company at Ohio State? Again, this is what we're talking about. This is and it's reflected in the advanced analytics. This isn't me just spitballing here. Again, I've given you some examples here and there of talent that has transferred out, but if you want, the cold hard numbers, it is shown in various analytics, whether it's the power index or just different rankings that show the output of offense and defense and just overall team performance. The good teams have fallen closer or fallen down a little, and the bad teams have come up. The bottom dwelling teams from last year compared to this year were about a field goal lower in terms of production output. Again, that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're raising the floor of everybody and dropping the ceiling, it's evening a lot of things out, and you're seeing it in the rankings. There's been, and we'll discuss these teams later, but there's been maybe 2 dominant teams, if that. And there's been a few surprises. But I just wanted to start off this episode by, again, this isn't a stamp of approval for how NIL has been handled or how the transfer portal was handled. I mean, the NCAA, for all intents and purposes, was just basically forced to do those things through various litigation, court cases, and all those different things. And they weren't a forward-looking organization anticipating the future, because that's just how they are. They just unfortunately care about the money and not about the benefits that can be offered to the students. Let's be real. Because if that was the case, they would have foreseen what was going to happen with NIL once the court cases and all that stuff were developing and being presented, and have a backup plan. And it's clear that this is the wild, wild west right now. Eventually, like all markets, it would eventually correct itself. But there should be that invisible hand, so to speak, guiding certain things. I do think, make no mistake about it, folks, I do think these college kids should be getting paid. There's too much revenue in the sport for these students not to get a piece of the pie. Now, you could get me in an argument about how much the kids should be getting, in the sense of what the top end kids should be allowed to sign for, and how much of the revenues should be distributed among all the members of the team. If there's a salary cap, so to speak, I could be in favor of something like that, but we're kind of straying too far here. The point is, I believe overall NIL transfer portals, or the NIL and the transfer portal, have actually been a net positive for the sport itself. Now, on to the bet. We're going to talk about the most disappointing team so far. And number one, it's pretty obvious who it is. I'm not going to get too deep into them, but it's Florida State. You're ranked in the top 10 coming into the season. You had a revenge tour planned, so to speak, for missing out on the playoffs, reloading the transfer portal, and a lot of misses, a lot of missed evaluations, and there they are at 1-5. So again, we'll get to them in a different podcast with our mid-year review of the Seminoles, so don't want to use too much time on them. But number one, head and shoulders above everybody else, Florida State. They've got two number ones in their name today. Number one for most disappointing team, and number one for wins. So, yeah, not the season you expected if you were a Seminole fan. Number two, I'm going to have to go with the Utah Utes, led by Kyle Whittingham. I had them as my Big 12 favorite, but so far they're 1-2 in the conference, and Cam Rising is injured once again. And they finished either 8-4 or 8-5 last year. I know it was an 8-win season, and they had high expectations going into that season. And they were derailed by a massive amount of injuries to the team. And then this year, they've stayed healthier than they were last year. But again, the issue is depending on seventh-year quarterback Cam Rising. And, he can't be glued together at this point. So my miss was expecting him to stay healthy or healthy enough to lead this team in 8 games this season, and hoping that the coaching staff could figure out the other few games that he missed. But it's not happening, folks. They're definitely not going to be winning the Big 12 or competing to even play in the championship game at this point, with the likes of BYU and Iowa State ahead of them, amongst other teams. Kansas State. There's other teams out there that are still well ahead of them, and they haven't played those guys yet. So, number 3, I should put them higher, actually. Utah shouldn't have been number 2. Utah should have been number 4. Maybe 3. But number 3, I got Ole Miss. Led by Lane Kiffin. This is a team that went all in for this season. You saw, how much talent they got in the transfer portal. Walter Nolan, Henry Parrish Jr. I believe they got another wide receiver. They got plenty of guys in the transfer portal. And they had playoff expectations. It wasn't a daunting schedule. It was relatively, realistic for this team to have maybe 2 losses at the end of the season. But, it hasn't played out that way. They came out roaring at the beginning, and their offense looked incredible. But as soon as they started to play teams with a pulse, they started tumbling down the rankings. They were a top 10 team, and now they're at 18. And, I guess maybe that's why Utah was ahead, because both Florida State and Utah aren't ranked anymore. If I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure Utah is not ranked. That is correct. They dropped from 16 out of the rankings this week. So, yeah, 5-2, 1-2 in SEC play. And can they get back in the race? They have the talent. There's no question about that. But can Lane Kiffin keep these boys focused on not having any more losses for the rest of the season? I don't think that's likely. I really don't. You've already wasted your mulligan on the Kentucky game, where you should have won that game. That's the first time they lost to Kentucky at Ole Miss since, was it the 70s or the early 80s or something like that? And then you lose a very, very winnable game at Death Valley against LSU, where you left opportunity after opportunity on the board to put points on the board. Sorry. And yeah, just not a good look. And it's just, again, it's unfortunate, because high hopes lead to this disappointing season so far. Number 4, Michigan. Again, they're 4-2. Not all is lost with Michigan. They're still in the top 25, barely at 24. But with the games left against Ohio State, or the team up north, if you want to say it like that, no, that's not the team up north for their side. I think that's what Ohio State says. But you face Ohio State in the big game, the game at the end of the year. You face Oregon, Illinois, and Indiana. Yes, both those teams, I know, the last 2 teams, Illinois and Indiana. It sounds weird, but those are top 25 teams. Illinois is at 16, and I'm sorry, uh, Indiana's at 16, and Illinois is at 22. You at best case scenario, you're looking at 2-2 against those teams, and you already have 2 losses, so you're looking at 4. They don't have a passing game. Can they win 7 to 8 games with a solid running game and a stout defense? Again, if the running game can't get going, if there's no offensive output, the defense is going to get worn down eventually. And it's not a smart choice to have an inability to throw the ball. I know some people might point to Iowa and say, hey, they've done it for years, but it's just not conducive for success. And again, 2-2 is looking good against that 4-game lineup. Who's to say they don't suffer another injury or, just get absolutely decimated in one of those games and it changes the complexion of the season? We'll see how that pans out, but right now it's a very worrisome season for Michigan so far. And at number 5, it's another team like Michigan at 4-2. It is, again, you go from Florida State and Utah to Ole Miss, who's 5-2, and you've got these other teams who are 4-2. But it's how they're getting there that's what's making these teams disappointing. Oklahoma struggles to score. Period. They were having issues against Houston. I believe that won the game 16-15 or 15-14, something like that. And you look at their schedule, and you've got games against South Carolina, Ole Miss, Missouri, Bama, and LSU. The one game that you have on your schedule that you're favored to win, even though they are favored by 1.5 against South Carolina, but I really think that line's going to move significantly in South Carolina's favor, because I think they were a 3-point favorite or a 3-point underdog. South Carolina was, and now it's already at 1.5 after a day or two on the market. Maine is the only game you have left that you're guaranteed win. And I mean, if you're at 4-2 now, you're basically at 5 wins with the Maine game. You're in all likelihood going to lose to Alabama and LSU. That puts you at 5-4. Missouri, they don't look that impressive either, but I mean, how many of those games are you going to win? The South Carolina game, and that puts you at 6 wins. Is that going to be a successful season for Brent Venables and company? You don't have an offensive line. This defense is good. Borderline great, if you ask me. But again, when the offense can't produce anything, you get games like you do in the Red River rivalry. Let's say that a little slow. Red River rivalry. That's how you say it faster, whatever. That game was 34-3 because Oklahoma couldn't move the ball. And the defense is always out in the field. Eventually, the bend don't break aspect, there is a break that occurs. So it's unfortunate that this defense is paired with this offense because, and especially Venables, who's a defensive mastermind. It's just a shame that they don't have any sort of offensive output. But that's what I have for my most disappointing teams. Least impressive, if you want to put it that way. My most impressive teams. We'll go 5-1, I think, on this one. Number 5, and this isn't the homer in me, but when you look at some of these teams, like Navy's undefeated, Army's undefeated, Pitt's undefeated, Indiana's undefeated, BYU's undefeated, Iowa State's undefeated, Penn State's undefeated. I've omitted some of those teams from this list because, Penn State struggled against Bowling Green. Penn State was losing 20-6 at halftime against USC. Penn State's had a few good wins here and there, but, they haven't scored as much as you wanted to. I believe, was it against Michigan State or someone? They won 21-7, something like that. But again, you expect more from them. Same thing with Pitt, and all those other teams. I'm putting Miami at number 5, the U. And they were dominant to start the season. They were beating the teams they should have been, and they were absolutely destroying them. And yes, you can point to the 2 slip-ups over the past few weeks against Virginia Tech and Cal, but at the end of the day, you're winning those games. And you may not be doing well in certain quarters, whether it's the second quarter or the third, or just overall in the first half and going into the second half. But if you listen back to the podcast that I posted previously about these games, I mean, absolute domination in the fourth quarter against Cal. I think they got to listen back to that one, but I have the stats there. I don't have them in front of me right now off the top of my head, but I believe Cal only averaged 1.7 yards per play in the fourth quarter. They were outscored significantly, obviously, in that quarter because, they were up by 30. It was 25-point comeback, and they were up, 38 to... I forgot what it was, 38-14. I don't know what it was. But, or 35. It was 35-10, I guess. But it was just one of those things where Miami shows their dominance, to get to that point of victory. So, again, the end result isn't what you want, but they're 6-0, and they're looking the part of the ACC favorites right now. And they got the bye week, or they had the bye week to clean things up. So we'll see how they go up against Louisville. Number 5, I'm going to have to go there, folks. Yes, old Dabo has proven me wrong again, as Clemson is 5-1, and I want you to find people who would project for this to happen after that Georgia game where they lost. Was it 34-3? They looked lifeless against that team in the second half. But now the offense is humming. And again, Georgia's fully healthy in the first game, and so is Clemson. But Clemson was playing a lot of older wide receivers when they have talented young wide receivers. And Dabo was saying, you should wait. You should look at these guys. You should look at these guys. Once he actually started playing it, he wasn't lying, folks. And now that Garrett Riley's unlocked the concept of Clay Kubnik being able to run the ball as well, this offense is averaging nearly it's like 48.67 or 86 points. So basically 49 points a game after that game. The only game I think they didn't score like a tremendous amount of points was against FSU, where they, I think it was 29-13, I think was the final. But they left 6 points off the board with the 2 blocked field goals. So technically it would have been 35-13. And they absolutely dominated that game in terms, I think they had over 500 yards or at 500 yards of total offense. So again, they just didn't put the points on the board. But again, 49 points per game. They should be favored in every remaining game and should meet UM in the championship game. And that should be a really good game at this point. They still have a tremendous defensive line. They may not be as strong on the linebacker and back end as they were in the past, but there's still a lot of talent on that team. And I will give credit where credit's due. I've been waiting to burn this man at the stake. But yeah, Dabo's done a tremendous job this season. I will give him credit for that. Number 3, and by the way, spoiled that one. By the way, Clemson is ranked number 10, and Miami's ranked number 6 right now. Just in case I didn't say that. Right now, I have the 14th team in the nation as my number 3 most impressive team. That's Texas A&M. They had a close loss to start off the season against Notre Dame, but ever since then, they haven't lost again, and it's been punctuated at a certain point a few weeks ago by a 41-10 victory over Missouri. They've got a toss-up game against LSU, and the Texas matchup being the toughest games left. Mike Elko could have a really strong debut season. I mean, if you win that LSU game, and maybe you're not going to be favored against Texas, obviously. But if you finish the season with 2 losses, I mean, that's an incredible start to the Elko era and in Aggie land. College Station should be really satisfied. I guess I'll just use that word for now. They should appreciate the work that Mike Elko has done so far, if that's the end result. And it is possible that they could end up with only 2 losses this season. But even with a 3-loss team, I mean, all those years of untapped potential in the Jimbo Fisher era. And, you did lose a lot of talent in the transfer portal, but you were able to bring some in. And that's thanks to Elko and his coaching staff. So I believe they should be ranked as one of the most impressive teams in the country so far. Number 2, I've got Oregon. After struggling the first 2 games, Oregon crushed Oregon State, and then they convincingly beat UCLA, Michigan State, and then they just beat Ohio State 32-31, who was previously the number 2 ranked team in the country. So they should have a clear path to the Big Ten championship game. The only 2 remaining challenging games they have left is the Illinois and Michigan encounters. But, they play Purdue on a short turnaround this week on Friday, but that shouldn't really be an issue. So, Oregon was one of the favorites coming into the season to be in the new college football 12-team playoffs. And it appears, even though people were wondering what was going on with them after the first 2 games, they look like they've righted the ship, and they're going to be a force to be reckoned with this season. And again, they may not be as dominant as people thought they would be, but it's Dan Lanning finally won that big game at Oregon. You lost the 2 games to Washington. You got destroyed by Georgia in his first year. So, it was a battle of Ryan Day versus Dan Lanning, who could win the big game that, they always try to lose in. And yeah, Oregon won that game. So they're credited with being one of the most impressive teams due to the strengths of their wins. And that leaves us with the number 1 team, and they're the number 1 team in the nation, and that's Texas. They haven't been threatened any of their games, and they have dominant wins on the road against Michigan and the neutral site against Oklahoma in the Red River rivalry. The Michigan game was 31-12, but I mean, the score was a lot closer than that game actually was. Michigan was completely, utterly, totally dominant in that game. I reviewed that game in one of the earlier podcasts. I believe the longest rush they allowed was 12 yards, I think, or maybe it was less. They couldn't move the ball against Texas. And, again, we just talked about the Oklahoma 34-3 loss, and they just wore down that defense. And, they missed Quinn Ewers for a few weeks, and they didn't skip a beat with Archie Manning. They still have Georgia and A&M, but everything so far shows that they're the best team in the country. And, you're favored against Georgia, and you're going to be favored against A&M. So even though those are the challenging games, you're still going to be a favorite in all the remaining games. So it's just a matter of, Sark and company leading the team to the promised land and keeping that number 1 ranking. The old adage is Texas back. It's almost like, Texas, UM, like some of these schools, are they back after, so many years? But that could be the case now, folks. So there's 10 teams. All in all, I mean, it's been a really interesting college football year so far, and you've had a lot of interesting games. I mean, you had this past week, the October 12th, where it was hyped up to be one of the biggest days in college football. Well, the biggest day in college football this season for sure, and it really didn't disappoint. You had the Oregon Ohio State game. Alabama struggled for a second consecutive week against South Carolina, eking out a 27-25 victory. Penn State came back from down 26 at halftime to win 33-30. You had the Florida-Tennessee game where Florida put up another fight, They lost Graham Mertz for the season, but they gave Tennessee everything they could handle and then some. So Tennessee, squeaked by with a 23-17 victory in OT. We mentioned the LSU Ole Miss game earlier. LSU just, they didn't give up, and now Lane Kiffin's saddled with 2 losses, and the only loss that LSU has right now is against USC, and Brian Kelly is leading this team again with a lot of injuries at hand. They lost Harold Perkins for the season. That's their best defender. And we talked about they don't have a lot of depth at defensive tackle either. So you lost your best rusher or just best overall defensive player, and you're testing your depth, and you're still finding ways to win. They're currently 8th in the country at 5-1. Will they be able to sustain that? Maybe, maybe not. But at least for now, they're doing the job. And then, Kansas State beat up a depleted Colorado team. They lost, I think, like every single one of their top wide receivers in that game. So it's been an interesting few weeks in football. The week before, you had obviously the Miami Cal game late, and then you had that was the Texas A&M game. You had that was the Vanderbilt Alabama game, which to me, again, I just wanted to give a shout out to Vanderbilt for that game. Tennessee lost to Arkansas, Michigan lost to Washington, Minnesota beat USC. But that Alabama Vanderbilt game, I want to carve some time out for that. And just, again, give a shout out to Vanderbilt. I don't want to stray too far away from this midpoint game, because we're probably going to review later on some interesting games that have happened over the past few weeks, and just save that for another podcast so we don't stretch out this one too much. So that's it for this episode, folks. This is one of the longer ones, so thanks for listening through. The drill already. You know what I'm about to say. Apple Podcast, YouTube, Spotify. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, give us those positive ratings, all that stuff. Comment if you want. Give us some feedback of what you think of the subject so far. Again, trying to pump out that college football content, because we're in the thick of it right now. So it's a good season. It's well, maybe not for some teams, but overall, it's a good college football season. It's an exciting one, and so there's a lot to talk about. So I'm gonna keep on trying to pump that out for you, and yeah. So thanks for listening. Thanks for stopping by, folks, and we'll catch you next time here on 305 Insights.